So first off, thank you to Creative Mornings and John, the folks at Media Temple, Greg and his team here, and the Verve and Shortcake groups who happen to be my clients. So it's nice to have them here as well. I think it's an exciting time for cities, especially in global cities like Los Angeles. And I'm excited to be here to talk about what's going on, share my perspective. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about me and why I'm here, and share some of the perspective that we have on what's going on. So basically, I think there's a lot of different ways to look at the city, ways to look at urbanism, different perspectives. We have a particular perspective. So this saying from Rem, from his seminal book, Mutations, I think really sort of starts the tone of urbanism. It's certainly something we identify with, this idea of speeds, different speeds, architecture and buildings really just being vessels for movements and flows. And when I started Creative Space, it was really looking at the city, Los Angeles, and really wondering how the heck all these exciting things happened, despite the fact that the real estate industry really didn't understand or care what was going on. So I started the company really with that simple perspective. So I don't know what's going on here with the feedback. Just a little bit about me. I grew up in a suburb like a lot of people. My parents were raised in Los Angeles. Moved my sister and I out to Newport Beach, and I felt even as a kid that there was something more outside of where I grew up. And so I became a competitive tennis player, played all around the world, ended up actually meeting my now business partner when we were kids, playing tennis in Chicago. I went to school at USC, bachelor's and master's degree from USC, ended up working for a big multinational based out of Australia, doing pretty much generic financial analysis and so forth. Eventually became a developer and got married, moved to Brentwood, joined a partnership in Netherland, which I don't miss at all. Built millions of square feet of this, which I think is pretty much reflective of the way the real estate world thinks. And then there was a shift. I started feeling like I was in the wrong place. And so 2005, most people were bullish. I started running for cover. I really felt like the economy was out of whack. And I told my senior partners that it was time to start preserving capital, stop spending, really starting to hunker down. This was early 2005. They said I was crazy. I said, screw it, I'm leaving. Left, took an open-ended trip, hated the real estate industry, never thought I'd get back into it. Then I was spending time in Santa Monica where I lived at the time, just really trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And my morning walk was on the boardwalk before people woke up, before the craziness started. It was a really cathartic sort of period. And I spent my afternoons at Earth, really seeing something like this, which is sort of that dichotomy. You've got real estate, and then you have this amazing city. And the reality is not all things are meant to go together. And what I found was my wife is a fashion designer, my best friend is a film producer, my other best friend is a music entrepreneur. And so my social life in Los Angeles was exciting and interesting. I went to work and it was just lame. So anyways, just one of those moments where it just sort of hit me. And I realized I had all this technical skill set and passion, and yet I was applying it sort of improperly, or not as well as I could. And so this idea started, coming into my thinking, but it was really just an idea. And I really looked around, talked to my best friend. Entertainment industry here in Los Angeles is a huge industry, as we all know. I don't know if people realize how big it is, but just 80 billion a year in output is pretty significant for any industry, any city, for that matter. And we have a lot of these, but the entertainment industry is a big one, and has more of an impact than just economics. I mean, it influences a lot of things around the city, and so I really, I just started thinking about it. I said, wow, what about real estate and entertainment? They use the space in so many different ways. Why isn't there a real estate company that specializes in that? There's certainly real estate companies that do a lot of things, but why wouldn't you specialize in something so significant and relevant and complicated? I also went to my first boss, who became my partner, my stepfather, who's a very successful real estate investor, and they tilted their heads and they did not know what I was talking about. And so, naturally, I knew I was onto something. So this idea, I just really started to think about it and all the different applications of space within the entertainment industry. But it was really just an idea. I mean, the business model wasn't clear yet. But I read a book that was written called Disruption. It ended up being a series of books in the 90s and early 2000s. It became the modus operandi for TBWA Shy Day. It's this idea of a system for people that hate systems. It's a philosophy and methodology for looking at the marketplace, looking at ideas, looking at what they consider to be conventions, which are impediments to clear thinking. And they have this whole philosophy and methodology that they use. And it was really inspiring. It wasn't like I took it and said, oh, I'm going to do that for real estate, but it really helped influence some of my thinking early on. But it was early. In 2009, people were hiding, people weren't doing anything. I came out, created this brand, everyone thought it was weird and didn't understand it, so it just took time. But what was obvious was it wasn't just entertainment that I ultimately was focused on. It was neighborhood and city and things that are happening, putting real estate in the conversation with the movements and flows, as opposed to the real estate industry trying to chase after movement and flows, and it's always this sort of disconnect. So I really wanted to solve or attempt to solve that disconnect. Then all of a sudden, Handsome Coffee came around. We were in an office in Hollywood, sort of business to business, and we got a call from Handsome Coffee. They were left intelligentsia. They wanted to be in the Arts District. The Arts District is a great up-and-coming neighborhood, but it's an industrial neighborhood, and none of the real estate people had any clue what coffee was, particularly artisanal third-wave coffee. And so they called, Tyler Wells called 150 times, so he says, I believe him, and no one would call him back. And he said, what the heck? So they ended up going to Hollywood and found a broker that was more than willing to help him out, took him to a building in the media district that they didn't know at the time was not zoned properly for coffee roasting. Coffee roasting is really the equivalent of bomb making from a zoning standpoint. And so the broker said, sure, here's an expediter, go ahead, no problem. The day that Tyler and the guys were going to sign the lease, Tyler went down to the city, and the city said, there's a queue on title. You cannot roast coffee here. And literally, they thought their world had ended. I mean, it's three young guys, leaving with passion, wanting to do better with coffee, and the real estate industry basically, came back and bit them. And just lo and behold, it was just out of accident. I was in my office, they were walking by, we started talking. They said, we want to be in the Arts District. We said, well, that's great. A lot of people do, but it's really difficult. And they said, we know, and they told me the story. So the next morning, we took them to where their now space is, and the rest sort of is history. But what we really found was this idea, this disconnect really was demonstrated. But it was more than just, the disconnect in the entertainment industry, the disconnect in business. It was really disconnect in neighborhood. And so, we went really from a business-to-business type of operation to, business to neighborhood, but just that idea that we were really going to be part of neighborhoods as they were evolving and really offer a different alternative perspective and approach that we thought was missing. So what really became really fascinating for me was my childhood friend who was a competitive tennis player with me, Michael Smith, who went on to co-found C Magazine and a music programming company called Playlist Generation. He was the second person I went to with this idea back in end of 2008. And over time, I ended up helping his companies, and he became fascinated with what I was doing and actually joined as my partner about a year and a half ago. And so it really became this merging, this true merging. It's not a real estate company trying to be creative. It's not a creative company trying to be real estate. It's both really trying to make an impact on neighborhoods. So a lot of people, especially early on, wondered exactly what we did. I don't know if these bullet points are going to help or further confuse, but hopefully it does make some sense to everyone. We really see ourselves as an accelerant. There's plenty of companies that can take you on tours, broker deals, design a space, build out a space, buy buildings, so on and so forth. But we really didn't think there was anyone that could really enhance, accelerate, empower all the different parts into an outcome that was unique. So we really became more of an active accelerant than anything else. But if you wanted to put it into a sentence, this would essentially state what we do. And it's really focusing on the movements and flows centered around businesses, brands, and people. We really see ourselves as sort of being in the position to empower the creative, as opposed to the other way around. Like I said, we're focused on movements and flows. Our job, today is really orchestrating outcomes. If you're a business and you say this is what we want, most of the industry sort of works in silos. We took that out and really looked at outcomes and reverse engineering the process. As a company, we sort of offer services sort of in these general categories, which may or may not mean anything, but essentially, it's front-end thinking, followed by, activating, repurposing, regenerating buildings and places, and then, real estate is, especially the signage is blight in neighborhoods, and so we really thought, wow, why wouldn't you apply the same approach that you would in clothes or food or what have you to the vessels that house these things? So we really rethought some of the marketing tools and approaches. I talked about integration versus silo. I think anyone that's ever gone through a process trying to find a store or try to open up a business, it's very frustrating. The learning curve is pretty steep, and there are very few people out there that really think about the outcomes. Because we became really involved in neighborhoods, we really had to think about the framework that we were using. We couldn't disregard the neighborhood that we were coming into. So it became clear that putting a framework in place, giving people the opportunity to participate was extremely important. We're also hyper-focused on the balance between being timely and timeless. And we're also infatuated with this idea of all trends can be predicted. So we really do look through things as a trend curve. And if we had to position ourselves or people asked where we were, we'd prefer to be at the front end as opposed to the back end, although you can make a lot more money on the back end usually. We also utilize a variety of foreign ingredients, which to us makes sense, but to a lot of people it's confusing. And like I said before, it's about putting the creative in the center of the circle instead of the real estate broker. I think most people would agree. And at the end of the day, it's about the business of creative. We're empowering creativity. We're empowering neighborhoods. We're not the neighborhoods. We're not the creatives. All right, so that's a little bit about myself, just to give some context and explanation. But really, what we're here today to talk about is urbanism. And I think there's a lot of different ways to approach urbanism. Certainly to approach the conversation about it. And so, I think understanding what urbanism is, this is a pretty good saying. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people, so I'm not going to try to define it here. But really, ultimately, it's about the interaction between inhabitants and the physical environment. I think these are pretty fascinating. This really reflects what's happening in the world today. The rate of change from the first 10% to the 50, 100 plus years. Now this is pretty interesting. It tells you where the world's gone. And it's pretty fascinating. So there's a lot of things happening. I think like John talked about, it's pretty timely. There's a lot of interest around cities, around urbanism today. One of the more interesting ones is a project that BMW and Guggenheim developed. They started in 2011, and it's basically a moving lab. They visited 3 cities, first New York, then Berlin, and then Mumbai. And they developed these ideas with feedback. And I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but I do think it is interesting that 2 organizations, art and cars, would come together to talk about urbanism in the city. It's obviously central to life, particularly as movement into cities continues to increase. So if you're curious, this is one of the good resources out there right now that you can sort of fall into. But one of the more interesting ideas that came out of this is this idea of participatory urbanism. Essentially, everyone can participate. We're a technical piece of the puzzle, but I think the idea that everyone owns the city is something that is true. And this just being timely and being of the moment, I thought this particular idea is something to embrace. So there's a seminal book called Mutations. I don't know how many people have heard of it or read it, but it's really based upon research that Rem Koolhaas and Harvard Design School have developed starting in the 90s. This is over 12 years old, and it feels more relevant than pretty much anything I've seen on the topic of urbanism. The book is itself, and just this idea, that things have to change. There's constant change, and in order to be able to handle the millions and millions or billions of people moving into cities over the next 100 years, things have to change. So what Mutations does, it basically breaks down the city into basically a set of parts. And what it says is a city is essentially very easy to build once you know how a city works. I'm not going to go into all the technicals of it, but there are 4 elements that they speak to about a generic city, and then that generic city becomes a specific city, and that's how it essentially comes together. But it's a set of standardized parts on a matrix, organized according to general principles, which are socially, culturally, and politically determined. It's a relationship of changing flows superimposed onto a generic template. And then once you have it all, you have the ability to customize your city according to sort of the local conditions. Pretty simple. What starts becoming more interesting is the perspective on the city, this idea that it's generic and specific, this idea that when all these things come together, interesting things happen. What's happening in the world, what we're seeing in sort of this creative movement, it's really about information and communication and this movement of capital. In the past, that capital and movements were really controlled by governments. What's happening today are cities, the territories are blurring, and it's really becoming this world of global cities. And those global cities are really the centers of innovation. And there's a reason why certain cities around the world have these concentrations and others don't. It is what it is, but I think it's important to note. Whose city is it? It's a question to ask. It's going to be a question that becomes more and more relevant as time goes on. So this movement between suburban and urban, there's a lot of emotions about it. There's a lot of opinions. I mean, from our perspective, I grew up in a suburb, so I have to be thoughtful of that. But I really do believe in cities. I believe in clear thinking. I believe in the power of neighborhoods. And so I think it's really important that as we move into the future, that that participatory urbanism concept really plays true, and that cities are protected, the neighborhoods are protected from the suburban mentality of trying to control things, trying to force things into boxes. Real estate industry is really a proxy, so it's going to do whatever it thinks is valuable. But I guess that's what we're trying to help change. So we were asked a couple years ago by a development company who we rarely work with, but every once in a while we'll take something on that's interesting. It's a group that developed District La Brea over on La Brea, and they really wanted to do what they did there and sort of spread it around, thinking that they had this great sort of tool set that everyone wanted. We listened for a little while, we sort of lost interest, but through that they asked us to put together a strategy and a set of ideas around it that they could use to support the investment thesis. So a lot of these things are obvious. Most of you being in the creative world will sort of this will all make sense, but when you put it on paper and you organize it, it starts really, there's some underlying things happening that I think are interesting. So this idea of the transformative economy, the cultural economy, Daniel Pink, there's a lot of talk about this stuff, but it's true and it's happening. This idea of distributed capital, McKinsey Consulting, which is a big consulting firm, wrote a paper in 2010 on this topic. It's very fascinating. Apple was probably the best example of this movement towards the individual. So the creative class, I think the interesting thing is that creative class and post-industrial cities, regeneration sort of go hand in hand. And what Richard Florida's research has found is there's sort of three key elements: talent, tolerance, and technology, that are critical. And I think if you overlay that to the cities around the U.S. at least, that you're seeing this stuff happen, those things are in high percent relative to the general population. So the millennial generation, I'm not going to spend any time talking about it, but I think this point that there's 3 million more millennials and baby boomers is pretty significant. The largest wealth transfer in history is going to be taking place between millennials and baby boomers. It changes the marketplace. Also this one, which 77% of millennial generation plan to live in an urban core. That's interesting. So, what's happening, is this entrepreneurial movement is taking place. I think the idea of it, of inventing the future, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of excitement. Small business fuels the economy. When you put, sort of innovative thinking into the mix, interesting things come out. So I think we're just starting to see that. And really, this idea of networks, the obituary of the office. Why do you need to be in an office when you can be out in the world seeing things? But if you don't come together, if you're not sharing ideas, then you're no better than you were with the office. So there's sort of this finding where that is in the world that's happening is really the future. And a lot of people talk about space and place. This is more about public space and public place, but these are certain elements that need to be in place in order to really create a sense of place. Up in San Francisco, which is a small city, but a lot of exciting things happening. We have an office up in the Mission. We work with the nonprofit that's really behind this. It's called SF Made, and they're really focusing on the makers movement and supporting local manufacturers. It's really fascinating. We just did a big project with Heath Ceramics and the Mission that's celebrating manufacturing and the experience of manufacturing and Blue Bottle coffee. It's really interesting. But that's happening all over the country and all over the world. This is my favorite one. So an economist named Christopher Leinberger actually did econometric studies and determined that the neighborhood grocery center caused the recession. But this is the real estate industry, and it's moving into urbanism, better than staying in suburban. But if there isn't some intervention, the same thing will take place in a matter of time. So now that there's sort of a primer, a framework, we can talk about a neighborhood. It's a neighborhood that we came into by accident, although as a college student, I spent a few nights in the Arts District back in the 90s. Handsome Coffee brought us down to the Arts District. Otherwise, I don't know if we'd be there, but we spent a lot of time there, and it's very fascinating. This is a map from 1909. You can actually see it across the street at next to whatever the restaurant is next door. Arts District is in the bottom corner. So 1909 downtown, minus a couple of the skyscrapers, was pretty much built out. The valley wasn't, which you can see in the foreground or the background, but it was a clustering of the buildings you see today, just with different movements and flows. So this idea of constantly evolving, constant change, Arts District represents that, I think, better than any other part of the city. At one point, it was the home to the largest winery in the world. Glossy Winery stretched 50 miles from Ontario to downtown. We worked on a grocery store called Urban Radish, and the first location was going to be the original farmhouse, which is on Palmetto, the P Building, 1248 Palmetto. Back in 1981, the first legal artisan residence, AIR, which was a precursor to the adaptive reuse, which helped bring this neighborhood on. But the Arts District was the first in the city of Los Angeles to have it. Factory Place is actually the building that first used this ordinance. So the neighborhood is interesting, and it's constantly evolving, movements and flows. M3 zoning, that's really the most important component of the neighborhood, why so many interesting things are happening, why it's really a petri dish of ideas, because you're allowed to do it. Most parts of the city, or any city for that matter, do not have this kind of zoning, at least the scale of it. So it really does prevent these ideas from coming together. Arts District allows it. It's a half square mile. The ecology, rivers, bridges, freeways, topography, empty boxes. At least purported to be the oldest building, the Pickle Building up on First Street, the first artisan resident application, and really the most diversity of uses anywhere in the city. And I really think it does reflect local and global, more global. It's really, to me, a microcosm of what's happening in urban cities around the world, more so than necessarily Los Angeles. I'm just going to go through a couple of the projects, not all the projects we're working on or have done, but just a couple of them. But what you see is, and I'll show you in a second what the Arts District is, but you have a lot of interesting neighborhoods surrounding it. Boyle Heights to the east, the Warehouse District, and then the rest of downtown to the west, down to Chinatown to the north. But that's really all it is. It's a half a mile, it's a couple streets, not a lot of buildings. But what's inside of it is what's interesting. Handsome Coffee was the first project, and then through that, some of the more interesting startups like Paquetto, who were in a loft building, came to us and said, we want to have a storefront for our e-commerce brand. There was only one storefront in the entire Arts District at the time. So the options were pretty limited, but we took what was a beautiful space, boarded up, and opened it up with some doors, created really mobile architecture, and it's come alive. It's a great addition to the neighborhood. This is a video game, a video game bar, which is in entitlements right now. But it's a really fascinating building, and it's going to be another bar on 3rd Street. So something to look forward to. This is down on the south end of the neighborhood. So most people probably know by now, but Stumptown is here. 100 Years, which is a digital agency. They do focus on public companies like TED and XPRIZE. There's a lot of TED events in this space here. It's right near Bestia and Retina, which we also worked on. Handsome Coffee, most people know about. Scene Cafe, this is a restaurant under construction we're overseeing, and it's 9,200 square feet. It'll be really the first open space. There's a 2,000 square foot garden in the middle, which is going to be fascinating. Alameda Square, which is a 32-acre site, 1.5 million square feet. It's home to American Apparel. We were tasked with developing a framework for how to bring this thing alive, how to make it interesting. We thought it was between the Fashion District and the Arts District, simply that it should be focused on fashion and technology and innovation around the apparel industry. VF Corps signed Splendid Ella Moss, moved in a few months ago. It's becoming an interesting destination for fashion. LA Game Space is one of the more interesting projects we've worked on recently. This is a nonprofit funded by a MacArthur grant, Kickstarter. This is going to be a artist in residence and a think tank for application of video game technologies. Steve Wozniak's on the board, which is interesting. A lot of buildings, this one in particular, old unreinforced masonry. Garrett Light, Derek Madison, and Keep Cup out of Australia were some of the businesses we brought life to it. It started out a couple years ago with some early stage companies and is sort of evolving. Touchstone Climbing, it's a client of ours in San Francisco. It'll be the first rock climbing gym ever in the city of Los Angeles, at least of destination orientation. So this is in Factory Place, which will be opening in about 3 months. Urban Radish, the first grocery store. This is a community project. We donated a lot of time. We did the architecture because they didn't have a budget for architecture. And it's really designed to be a footprint for small, self-contained markets in urban cores. This is the first. I don't know if anyone's been, but it's worth checking out. Art. So as I was showing the neighborhood and how small it is, what we started thinking about was the surrounding areas. Arts District is not big enough to support all the businesses that want to be there. If you don't have enough space, you don't have enough diversity in biology, you end up having issues. So we really started thinking about bonding together the rest of the neighborhood. Gavin Brown is a gallerist out of New York, came to us and said, we want to do something different. We said, Boyle Heights. So what started as a 1-year experiment turned into a 10-year lease. Laura Owens was the first artist. She took over this building. It's now a 50,000 square foot campus of some of the top art in the city. It's worth checking out. It'll be reopened at the end of this month. And Unique, Sonia, who spoke last year, I believe, here. This is going to be a new headquarters and a co-work and sort of open space. This is the original Bedlam, which was an underground art scene in the Arts District in the 80s. A friend of mine owns a building. We're reactivating it into something which should be interesting. I talked about some of these, but this is what we see every day coming into this neighborhood. Not that you don't see it in Venice or Culver City, but the scale of it is pretty amazing. And I think you're going to continue to see more of this. It's a lot of words, but essentially, we really saw this as an opportunity to engage with the neighborhood, this inclusionary framework, this idea of challenging the normal pathway of gentrification, coming together, really looking at linking the surrounding neighborhoods. It's a place and a mindset for urban discovery, which, it is what it is, but it really has become that. And, it's also a model for other neighborhoods, because it really does represent the future in a lot of ways. And so there you go. So in the end, I started this company because I wanted to do something that made things better. I love the city. It's a great place to be. It's exciting. And we're doing our part to make it more interesting and diverse.